Anyway, welcome everyone for our first rainy day seminar. I think we've needed the rain, so happy rainy day to everyone. Welcome to our Monday seminar series. As always, the seminar is co-sponsored by our friends at the Edwin O. Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies, and this time also by the Department of History. It's part of Worldwide Week at Harvard 2024, organized by the Office of the Vice Provost for International Affairs. Our speaker today is yet another speaker whom I've known for a number of years, Jesús Solís, who's a current postdoctoral fellow at the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations for this academic year. I know him because earlier this year, he received his PhD in history from Harvard, and I had the pleasure of teaching him in a couple of classes and knowing him outside of class as well. His dissertation was entitled Black Market Empire, the illicit sale of American goods, combat supplies, and drugs in Japan and America's Underground Lake, 1945 to 1975. Jesus's broader interests are Japanese and military history in the US and the world. His publications include The Drugs of War and Empire, Drug Consumption and Narcotics Trafficking During the Occupation of Japan, in an edited volume entitled Drugs and the Politics of Consumption, about 2023, and From Convict to Victim, Commemorating Labors on Hokkaido Central Road in the Asia Pacific journal Japan Focus in 2019. And he's also served as a consultant for season 2 of the TV show Pachinko on Apple TV Plus, which is, it's not the biggest item on your CV. It's a nice little, a little piece of candy, CV candy. Jesus's talk today is entitled Japan and America's Black Market Empire, 1945-1975. And as always, Jesus will speak for about 30 minutes, so we'll have some time for Q&A.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Professor Howell, for the kind introduction. I would like to thank everyone else at the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations, Megan, Pierce, Sophie, and Shin for all the wonderful work you do to make these weekly seminars possible. And I'd also like to thank the co-sponsors for today's event, everyone at the Reischauer Institute and the Department of History. So today I'm going to give a little talk about my current project, which is a book manuscript based on my dissertation about the illicit sale of American goods and military supplies in Japan and other areas in the Asia Pacific region. So I'd like to start my talk today in the year 1945. This is the year when World War II ended, and it was shortly after that that the United States military embarked on a project of creating an empire of overseas military bases in Europe and other places in the Asia Pacific region. Empire building, however, had many unintended consequences. It was very common to see scenes such as this near US military installations. In this video, we see a US soldier who is illegally selling American cigarettes and other goods from the US base to local black marketeers in Kyoto around 1946. So as you can see, many of these black market transactions were discovered by military policemen, but the majority of these types of illicit exchanges went unrecorded and therefore never entered the historical record. This makes it difficult to quantify the extent of illicit trading that took place near US military bases, but there is ample evidence to suggest that black markets near US bases were thriving during the post-war period. And it's this phenomenon that I call the black market empire. So what exactly do I mean by the black market empire? I define this as a pattern of illicit economic activity near US military installations that accompanied the construction of America's empire of bases and various military operations. These activities typically involve the diversion of military goods into informal channels. Or another way to think of this is that illicit trade followed the flag in the post-war world. The black market empire developed for several reasons. The first was the collapse of the Japanese Empire in 1945. The other was the construction of new borders and new laws. As Philip Pai has pointed out, the drawing of new geopolitical borders in the post-war world resulted in the formation of new zones of illicit trade. Another border that I want to focus on today is the borders created by the various U.S. military bases in Japan and elsewhere. What's especially important is the differences between life on base and off base. For the Americans living on U.S. military bases, their lifestyle was one of abundance and luxury. On the other hand, for those people in Japan who lived on the other side of the barbed wire, they were faced with poverty and widespread shortages. And finally, a major topic that I'll be talking about at great length today is the impact of the various hot wars in Asia during the Cold War and how this influenced the development of illicit economies in Japan. So now, a short note on terminology. The word for black market in Japanese is yami-ichi, which is composed of these two characters. Yami literally means dark, and ichi is a marketplace, so dark markets. The second character is actually a shortened form of this word, which is ichiba, which just refers to a marketplace where economic transactions take place. When scholars talk about the black market or yami-ichi in post-war Japan, this is what they're referring to. This is one of the thousands of black markets that prospered in the immediate wake of Japan's defeat. During this time, there were widespread food shortages, so Japanese civilians had to rely on these black markets for survival. Most scholars tend to describe the phenomenon of these outdoor black markets as one that took place roughly from 1945 until around the end of 1952, when the US occupation ended. There is, however, another way to read ichiba, and as Michael Molaski points out, this can also be read as shijo in Japanese. And when we talk about the black market as a shijo rather than an ichiba, what it specifically refers to is the black market as an economic system. If we think about the black market as an economic system in post-war Japan, we see that even after the black markets had disappeared from post-war society, the black market as an economic system, especially black market activity around US military bases, persisted for much longer. I therefore want to offer an alternative periodization of the black market and focus on this period today, which I call the long black market era. And this lasted from 1945 until 1975. Scholars have been extremely critical of the US military and its presence in Asia. And we can trace this trend back to the Vietnam War, when there were many scholars and students in the United States who spoke out against America's intervention in Southeast Asia. But we can also see evidence of this trend even today. Recently, scholars who have focused on the US military involvement in black markets in wartime Asia or in South Vietnam during the Vietnam War have described the black market as simply another problem that's caused by the US military. In my talk today, I will acknowledge that the black market was in fact a problem, especially for the American military officials and also host nations. But if we examine the motivations for why people actually engaged in this type of illicit behavior, we see that black markets for these people weren't necessarily problems, but rather solutions to the problems that they faced in the post-war world. And I therefore want to complicate the history of the US military presence in the Asia-Pacific region. Another thing that I want to highlight in my talk today is just how complicated illicit trade was. And I'll also mention not only the negative impact of illicit trading, but also some of the positive impact of these illicit economies. Next, I need to talk a little bit about how the US military supplied its system of its empire of overseas bases. After World War I, the US military created the post-exchange or the PX system. And this was a system of centralized shops that sold high-quality items at an affordable price to US soldiers who were stationed overseas. They provided goods such as these, which I think these will all be very familiar to you. In the case of cigarettes, these were usually tax-free and therefore very affordable even to the very low-ranking soldiers. Another important point that I need to emphasize is that only US servicemen and their dependents were allowed to shop in these particular stores. And I'll come back to this because this will explain why there was a black market that existed for these particular items in Japan. During the occupation, the US military opened a lot of these shops on bases, but in major urban areas such as Tokyo, they actually requisitioned Japanese department stores and turned them into major post exchanges. Perhaps the most famous is this one. This is the Tokyo PX in the Ginza district. And if any of you have ever been to the Ginza, You might have seen this building. This is called the Wako building today. It's no longer the Post Exchange. It's now a Japanese department store. But it's a very important landmark in the Ginza, but I think very few people realize this was one of the biggest department stores operated by the US military at one time. So now I want to talk about what happened during the occupation. Bernard Parlin drew this particular sketch, and he was working for Life magazine at the time. He was in Tokyo in October when the US cavalry first entered Japan's capital, and drew sketches of what he had seen. And this is one scene in particular that he wrote. And as we can see here on the left side, there is a US soldier. He has a bag full of cigarettes, and we see Japanese civilians who are eagerly purchasing these items. Bernard noted that these soldiers were purchasing these packs of cigarettes at the Post Exchange for 10 to 15 cents each, and they were selling them to these black marketeers for around 50 cents. And these black marketeers in turn sold those items on the black market for $1 or more. He also noted that this was very common, and the soldiers who engaged in this type of behavior made small fortunes during the first few years of the occupation. This transaction that I just showed you was illegal for several reasons. First, according to SCAP, the occupation officials, because there was no formal peace treaty signed between the United States and Japan, Japanese citizens were still considered Japanese nationals, and this form of commercial exchange was therefore a violation of the Trading with the Enemy Act. There are also Army regulations controlling the resale of Army exchange supplies, which basically said that it was illegal to purchase goods at the Post Exchange and resell them. An article of the Rules of Land Warfare stated that officers and soldiers were prohibited from using their positions for personal profit. And finally, there were tax implications. And the Internal Revenue Bureau became very interested in these types of sales when they learned that the Army fiscal officers had transferred to the United States $35 million more than the entire occupation forces had been paid during the first few months. And they figured out very quickly the reason why the amount that they had sent was more than they had been paid was because pretty much everybody in occupied Japan who was with the military was engaged in some type of black marketeering. They had threatened to contact the War Department and check the payroll records with the amount that they had remitted, and any discrepancies could result in penalties for tax evasion. On the Japanese side, this was also illegal. The US occupation officials warned that if any Japanese nationals were caught buying American cigarettes, chocolate, or candy, that they would be severely punished. In February 1946, the US occupation also set up a new series of courts that gave them the authority to try Japanese nationals who were found guilty of illegally purchasing goods from the Post Exchange. As I mentioned before, this type of illicit trading often solved the problems of the people who engaged in this behavior. So what kinds of problems were soldiers and Japanese civilians faced with at this time? Well, to make this easy to remember, soldiers and sailors wanted three things, or as I call the 3 S's. They wanted souvenirs, sex, and sake. All of these cost money, but they were faced with a problem, and that was the lack of funds to purchase these goods and services. One of the initial post-war agreements was that Japan would retain its own currency, so the yen would be used during the occupation. As a result, when soldiers entered occupied Japan, they were required to convert all of their dollars into yen. But they set a very unfavorable exchange rate, which resulted in a decrease in their purchasing power. Black marketeering, as I had just shown, was a very easy solution to this problem. For the Japanese civilians, they really desired these high-quality American luxury goods. There were a lot of scarcities during the war. Many of you are maybe familiar with the slogan, "Luxury is the enemy." They were often deprived of a life of luxury during the wartime, and all of a sudden they're confronted with the richest army in the history of the world, and they really wanted to also enjoy some of these fruits of American capitalism. And because they were unable to purchase these at the Post Exchange, the black market was the only way for them, was the only solution to this problem. So I want to move on and show perhaps some of the positive impacts of illicit trading that we might not necessarily always associate with this type of trading. And this was a comic that illustrates this next point that I want to make. This was a comic that was published in Pacific Stars and Stripes, which was the official newspaper for the US service members who were stationed in the Asia Pacific region at this time. And it shows a man who's just returned from his overseas tour of duty in Asia. And he has these two flags. And he explains, okay, I got this flag through 3 campaigns, and I got this other one for 2 sticks of gum and a chocolatito. So this really shows one is a war trophy, the other one is through exchange. And I think what this really shows is the Japanese soldiers and, the American soldiers and the Japanese start to view each other in a very different way. They were enemies at first, but then even though under the Trading with the Enemy Act, they were still technically enemies, they found that they had a common interest. And I think all of you are very familiar with the fierce fighting and the bloody battles of the Pacific, the animosity, the racism, and the atrocities that both sides had committed. But all of these feelings seem to kind of die out, and they no longer see each other as animals or ogres or demons, but rather as illicit business partners. And they're able to cooperate because they want to circumvent the laws. And they both see that this type of exchange could be mutually beneficial to both parties involved. As a side note, I think that this particular comic is actually lampooning this very famous Norman Rockwell painting, which was published on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post in October 1945. It's called Homecomings, and it shows a Marine who has just returned from the fighting in the Pacific. He's telling everyone in his neighborhood about his experience and showing off his flag that he had captured. And this comic was published, I think, 6 months after Rockwell's cover. So I think the readers would have probably been very familiar with Rockwell. US servicemen were not the only Americans who were involved in this type of illicit trade. We can hear this is an Army housewife who's delivering a bag full of American goods from the post exchange to this black marketeer, and she's accepting payment. I don't have exact statistics on how many women were involved in this type of illicit exchange, but I do have one story that might shed some light on this. Ralph Chapman was a reporter for the New York Herald Tribune, and he was reporting in occupied Japan, and he noticed when he was going to these different retail shops and department stores that they were well stocked with American goods that were obviously diverted from the post exchange. Everything from cosmetics, lipstick, perfume, nylon stockings, cigarettes were everywhere at Japanese retail stores. And eventually he asked them, where did you acquire these goods? And many of them answered, oh, nice American ladies brought them to us. So that gives us one example. But I did find other evidence that this problem actually extended beyond the shores of occupied Japan. When the first group of these wives returned to the United States, they started hosting these informal orientation sessions for the women who were getting ready to join their husbands in Japan. And they told them all about the lucrative black market and US military goods. They even encouraged them on what kind of products they should buy to sell on the black market. And this led to the development of this, which was a transnational smuggling ring, which mostly involved American cigarettes. And the US military found out about this because they started checking their luggage as they were entering the country, and they found suitcases with hundreds of cartons of cigarettes. When they confronted them and asked them why they needed so many tobacco products, they admitted that it was, quote, for trading purposes. So why did these women engage in this type of black market activity? As I mentioned, this often solved problems, but this has been a bit of a puzzle for me because as we can see in this photo, many of the Army housewives, I think, lived very comfortable lives in occupied Japan. They had very nice residences. As we can see by the photo, they had a lot of domestic help. So I don't think this was something out of necessarily economic necessity. And I'm also thinking that perhaps there were different motivations for engaging in black marketeering that weren't necessarily to solve problems. I think this probably could have been just a very simple case of opportunism. But this is still something that I'm researching, currently working on, and I want to learn a little bit more about as I'm working on the book manuscript. So now I want to talk about the impact of one of the hot wars of the Cold War, and that's the impact of the Korean War. I think when most people think about the impact of the Korean War on the Japanese economy, they think about the positive aspect. And Japan really benefited from the so-called special procurement boom, but this actually led to an increase in illicit economic activity. And this was for several reasons. The first was there were actually more soldiers in Japan Many of them had visited from Korea. They were on R&R, or rest and relaxation. They faced the same problems that the soldiers during the early phase of the occupation faced. They wanted a party, they wanted alcohol, they didn't have a lot of money. You could simply sell a few cigarettes on the black market, and that would allow them to have a good time. Also, as the standard of living in Japan improved and wages increased, many of the Japanese consumers desired higher quality goods. But unfortunately, Japanese companies were unable to produce the types of items that were available at the post exchange. And so they still had a demand for goods that could only be procured from the black market. It also had some interesting impacts on some of the outdoor markets, the yamiichi. This is ame yokocho, or candy alley. Ame means candy in Japanese. And during the early occupation, the black market stall keepers at this particular black market sold candy that was made of black market sugar and other ingredients. During the Korean War, they started to sell another type of ame, Americano shohi, or American goods. And it soon became called America Yokocho, or American Alley. At first, soldiers would come here to sell a few cigarettes or candy. But during the Korean War, many of them were deployed to the Korean front. They needed a place to sell all of their goods. So as a result, suddenly jeeps full of appliances and furniture started coming into this place, and they would just sell everything that they had to these black marketeers. And eventually, Ameyoko started to look like this, a place that was just filled with and specialized with these types of American goods from US bases. So what happened to the black market empire after the occupation ended in 1952? By mid-1955, the Japanese economy had recovered and it had entered the period of high-speed economic growth. And as a result, many of the goods that had only been available on the black market were now available through formal channels. I'll give you a few examples. So Meiji was finally able to start importing cocoa again and start making its famous milk chocolate bars. This made it unnecessary to buy Hershey's bars on the black market. There were also a number of new companies such as Rotte, which was a new candy manufacturing company, and it produced a lot of the bubble gum and candy that kids during the occupation enjoyed. Coca-Cola was another popular black market product. And although there were bottling plants on the bases, Japanese consumers couldn't get it for a number of years through formal channels. But fairly early on, Coca-Cola was able to get the right to start selling its goods to civilians legally. And finally, this is also a period when the Japanese hosiery manufacturers start to prosper. Manufacturers such as Atsugi really struggled to create the types of nylon stockings that were only available at the post exchange and were very fashionable. And so this made it unnecessary to buy nylon stockings and a lot of other goods on the black market. There was, however, one product that was still in high demand in the black market, and that was American cigarettes. The most outspoken critic of American cigarettes was this man, Noda Uichi. He was a member of the LDP, and he was vice president of the Japanese Monopoly Bureau. He called American cigarettes the great enemy of Japan's national finances. Again, we see the complicated nature of the black market. As I mentioned, the black market forced former enemies to see each other differently. When we see this from the perspective of the government, on the other hand, this really is an enemy and a real threat to Japan. And the reason why he said this is that the tobacco products, at this time, Japan actually had a monopoly on tobacco sales, and this was an important source of tax revenue. In other words, anytime a Japanese consumer bought black market cigarettes, that was money that was taken away from the Japanese government. This was a source of friction between Japan and the United States, but there is evidence that the two governments cooperated to try to stem the flow of illicit cigarettes from US military bases. One campaign included these posters, which were printed in English around US military bases, warning American soldiers that selling or giving Japanese nationals any type of duty-free tobacco products was illegal. These campaigns were largely ineffective. In 1963, Noda published this book called Tobacco, and he still complained about the same problem. And he criticized the PX for causing damage to Japan's economy. Unfortunately for Mr. Noda, the problem got worse with the outbreak of another war, the Vietnam War. So we can see here, this is a graph of the number of arrests of people involved in black market foreign cigarettes, which in this case, 90% of these are probably American cigarettes from US bases. And we see here in 1965, starting in 1965, we see an increase. So why is this significant? 1965 is the year that the Marines landed in Da Nang, initiating the start of an expansion of American military ground operations in Vietnam. As America's intervention increased in Vietnam, there were also more soldiers stationed in Japan, many of them on R&R. And we're going to see the same pattern again during the Vietnam War that we saw during the occupation, during the Korean War. A lot of these soldiers who came to Japan to party ran out of funds very quickly. In fact, it was a very low hurdle that the soldiers had to clear in order to get on the plane from Saigon to Tokyo. They really only needed about $50 cash. This ran out quickly, and not surprisingly, they started selling goods on the black market. We also see a decrease starting in 1970, and this actually corresponds to the period of Vietnamization. And this was, with this came a decrease in the number of soldiers stationed in Asia generally, and this meant less supply of black market cigarettes. For the last part of the presentation, I'd like to take us to South Vietnam and look at how the black market empire developed there while all of this was going on in Japan. Again, we see the same pattern. We see these black markets in Vietnam that start to form. These are very, very similar. The types of goods that you would have seen in occupied Japan were also being sold illegally on the black market at various black markets throughout South Vietnam. These are all goods that had been diverted from the post-exchange. There was a big demand for American goods even in Vietnam. However, the post-exchange in Vietnam and the post-exchange during occupied Japan was actually a little different. This is what a post-exchange looked like in South Vietnam. We can see this soldier is looking at a bunch of television sets. These post-exchanges were well stocked with all kinds of electronics. And most of those electronics were actually not from the United States. They were supplied by Japan. The US military, and in particular the Army Exchange Services, started to expand its operations and created the Pacific Exchange Service. This involved this catalog that all soldiers received, and they could order goods to be shipped from Japan to not only South Vietnam, but also Korea and other places where US service members were stationed. They sold a lot of the types of Asian souvenirs that people would have been interested during the occupation. Items such as lacquerware, folding screens, silk, traditional Japanese dolls. But this was the most popular item, electronics. And there were a lot of the major electronics companies had very lucrative contracts with the US military to supply soldiers with these types of goods. Meredith Lair wrote a wonderful book about the consumption of soldiers during the Vietnam War. And she emphasized just how important it was for a soldier to have these radios and speakers and a nice tape deck. And I think what we need to keep in mind is that a lot of these were from Japan. In fact, every single product on this catalog, on these two catalog pages, are made by Japanese manufacturers. We have National, Sony, and Akai, and also Toshiba books. Toshiba. There was also a black market that specialized in these types of goods from Japan. And they were typically what would happen is gangs would go to the docks where these goods would be shipped from Japan, and they would steal them and store them in secret warehouses. And there would be stalls in the black markets that had these catalogs. And if you wanted to order something from the catalog on the black market, you would just get the black market catalog. You would see what was available in their kind of secret stash, and the black marketeer would go and give it to you. And the last conflict that I want to talk about is the Cambodian campaign and the Cambodian Civil War in 1970 and the impact that this had on the black market economy. So as the US military became involved in Cambodia, the black market also expanded. In the border town of Bavet, this became the center of illicit trade. There were a lot of smuggling routes that would transport the goods from Saigon and other post exchanges into Bavet, and then they would be transported to other places in Cambodia. There was Henry Kam, who was a reporter for the New York Times, reported seeing the following. Too many Cambodians smoke American cigarettes, wear American fatigues, listen to Japanese transistor radios, fry their rice in American soybean oil, and treat themselves to Schiltz beer and their children to Tootsie Rolls to disguise the fact that great quantities of American supplies and post-exchange goods destined for Americans in Vietnam are smuggled into Cambodia, sold in a countrywide black market. So again, we see how the black market has not only expanded, but we also see we also see Japanese goods, and Japan is playing a role in the development of this black market, even if it's not intentional. And finally, I'd like to end my talk with the year 1975. This is the year that Saigon fell. And when Saigon fell, the North Vietnamese soldiers started looting a lot of the residences of the former American military and diplomatic officials. And these were, well stocked with goods that they had purchased from the post exchange during the 1960s and 1970s. And a lot of these goods made it to the black market. And there were a lot of black market stalls in North Vietnam that appeared, and people were selling a lot of these goods that people had looted from these Americans. So what did this look like? Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a particular image of these black markets. The North Vietnamese soldiers were ordered not to loot and not to buy anything on the black market. There were a number of foreign journalists present, however. There was a Japanese journalist who attempted to take a photograph of the black markets, but he was arrested and his camera was confiscated. So whatever photos he took are lost. However, we do have a report from a reporter from the Boston Globe who witnessed the following. The most crowded section in the 200-yard camera and stereo street where Vietnamese market women offer $500 Sony, Akai, and Sansui tape decks and amplifiers. The North Vietnamese in their baggy uniforms can generally be found clustered around stalls selling $5 to $15 Japanese radios. So we can see here again how Japan had really supplied the US military empire, and this in turn resulted in more Japanese goods on the black market in Vietnam in 1975. So I'd like to end my talk today very quickly by comparing this to this image that I showed earlier in 1945. And here we see Japanese civilians who are very eager to purchase American goods from the post exchange. But in 1975, we see North Vietnamese soldiers who are eager to purchase Japanese goods from the post exchange. And so I want to conclude by saying that this moment in 1975, we see how Japan had become a supplier of America's military empire, and eventually this forced it to become even more integrated into America's black market empire. And that's where I'll end my talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jesus. We'll open things up for Q&A, starting with, as is our custom, a first question from one of our associates. Today, it'll be Yokogoshi Ayu, who's in the Ministry of Finance, an official. I'm sorry, I lost the word official. Of the Ministry of Finance, who's here this year at Harvard. Her research project is economic security in the multilateral trading system, US-Japan policy coordination. So markets, maybe not black markets, but markets are part of her research project. So Yokogoshi-san.
Thank you very much for the insightful presentation. My name is Ayu Yokogoshi. I'm an associate at the US-Japan program at Weatherhead Center. I'm also with Ministry of Finance Japan. I'm honored to have the opportunity to ask the first question, and I'd like to ask about the differences in the background of black markets in Japan and Vietnam and Cambodia. In Japan, as mentioned in the presentation, black markets have emerged shortly after the war, driven by US military personnel seeking purchasing power, and Japanese people are trying to obtain US military supplies due to material shortages. So, in Vietnam and Cambodia's case, do you think the formation of black markets helped address any issues faced by US military personnel, or were they just driven by smugglers?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Ayu, for the wonderful question. So as far as the differences between Japan and Vietnam. Well, I think what makes the black markets different, they're similar in the sense that it's the diversion of military goods. But they're also for different purposes. I didn't really talk about this in the presentation, but a lot of the smuggling in Cambodia and Vietnam actually involved combat supplies that could have been used on the battlefield. So this involved things such as rations, which the Viet Cong needed. Because the advantage of those military rations, they're little kind of boxes of food that you didn't need to cook with, that you didn't need to cook. And so if they cooked, the Viet Cong would give away their position. So it was more things like that that were going on in the black market. So from the perspective of the US military, they're very different. In occupied Japan, if American military supplies made it on the black market, it might mean a loss to the American taxpayer. But in Southeast Asia, it's very different because they could be used against the army. So that's kind of where the background is different. As far as who's involved in this is a topic that I need to do a little more work on, but it seemed like it was mostly, as you mentioned, it was actually smugglers from Cambodia. And maybe I don't think that there were as many US soldiers who were maybe selling goods in Cambodia. I don't have any evidence of that. But I do think that there was more kind of organized gangs that started to form in that region during that time. Did that answer all your question or?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes. Go ahead. Yeah, why don't we just go in order? Yeah.
So my name is Humia. I'm an academy scholar at the Weatherhead Center, the Harvard Academy. Thanks for the talk. This is very interesting. I really like your kind of description of the kind of transaction nearby the PX. So then my question is kind of clarification. I think when people say like a black market, we tend to think that like people exchange their items, sell goods in the black market Yamiichi as a place. But actually some of the slides you presented earlier, I think it seems like people often exchange their items quite nearby the PX. So then in your framework, did you include those economic transaction nearby the PX is a part of the black market, or I'm not really sure the difference between like a transaction which took place nearby the PX and also the black market as a place. That's, yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I can answer that. Yeah, that's a great point. So I think the point that I was trying to make is that the black market really involves two things. It involves the actual marketplace, but also black market activity.
Sure.
So black market transactions. So in that case, I see that as kind of one black market, and they're kind of integrated into one kind of economic system. And that's why what I was trying to emphasize in my presentation was that we need to look at the black market as Ichiba, an actual place, but also Shijo, which is the actual system of the black market. So I do include in my definition,
Okay.
if there was any type of illicit exchange, which could be selling for currency, or it could be even exchanging for goods and services, which was something that was also common at this time.
I also wonder if there's any kind of intermediaries or any kind of like a middle person who try to kind of involve with the like exchange between like, transaction between like the soldiers of the American soldiers and a Japanese individual to make that transaction in the marketplace happen.
Yes, there were a number of kind of middlemen. So there were people that they were professional middlemen, and that was their job, was to procure those goods. And there were different ways that they could do this. What made it kind of difficult was sometimes they actually had to break into the base. So this involved things like impersonating a US soldier, stealing a uniform, sneaking in, taking it, trying to come out undetected. So you do have that. That's very high risk. And another kind of important source that I didn't really talk about, but I think other scholars have talked about, was kind of the role of the panpan or the prostitutes as intermediaries, because a lot of them did exchange in exchange for sexual services, instead of currency, would accept some of the black market goods. And this was just out of convenience because soldiers didn't necessarily always have cash, but they always had packs of cigarettes or candy. And they could take whatever they had gained from this transaction, they could resell it to these black market brokers. So that's just another example of these intermediaries.
Yes.
Yeah, excellent talk, Jesus. So,
Oh, could you introduce yourself?
oh yeah, I'm Evan. I'm a postdoc in the Weatherhead Center. I'm another historian. So it strikes me that like your description of engaging in black market, in the black marketeering, is one of like economic pragmatism. But I'm wondering if you found any political or ideological motivations for doing this. Because let's say you were giving this talk and I'm a specialist in military bases elsewhere. I know that like it's in the Caribbean, for instance, illicit activity and engagements around that, the way that people on the ground and governments interacted with it was deeply political and ideological. And there were things like racial resentments that happened on the ground. And so I think it was more than economic pragmatism. So do you find that in the Japanese case? Or does that make the Japanese case unique, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it could make it unique, and I haven't found any kind of political motivation for black marketeering. One topic that I wasn't able to include in this talk, but something that I talk about I did an entire chapter of it in my dissertation, was about smuggling during the Korean War and how, so the United States placed a trade embargo on the People's Republic, and they needed a way to get strategic goods, and they were kind of cut off from the world with the embargo. What they did was they actually used smugglers from Okinawa who were stealing stuff from the US military bases there, especially strategic supplies. They would smuggle those goods into Macau or Hong Kong. And then from there, other smugglers would take them into the mainland and they would be used against the Americans in the Korean Peninsula. And this really alarmed the Americans that the Chinese were turning America's outposts in Okinawa into supply bases. And they were kind of curious about what were the motivations, why were people doing this? And there was a fear that there was kind of this anti-American sentiment driving this type of smuggling. But what they found, in fact, was that was not the case. It was actually just because of Okinawa's devastated economy. That's what they just engaged in that type of behavior for economic pragmatism. There was really they found no motivation whatsoever of people doing this because they hated America or they had sign of anti-American bias. So I haven't found any examples yet. So I think that's a good point that you brought up, that I need to incorporate, is thinking about this more globally and thinking about maybe this does make the black market empire in Japan unique.
I think that's at least a really cool intervention then, if that is unique if it's going on elsewhere at the same time.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question from the chat, which I'll ask and then I'll turn to the audience again. This is from Michael Thornton. Hi, Jesus. It's nice to see how your project has developed. One thing I didn't fully grasp was how important the black market in the Shizhou sense was to the overall economy and military operations. We know that civilians needed to buy food on the black market, for instance, during the first desperate months after Japan's surrender. How do you assess the economic significance of the later black market? Do we know what the scale of this exchange was, for example, relative to Japan's overall exports?
Yeah, that's a great example. Thank you so much, Michael. In terms of the scale, I guess I'll start this answer by just talking about maybe comparing this to the black market in post-war Germany, for example, to give an idea of just how bad the Japanese economy was and the extent of the black market. So in Germany, after World War II, most people on average, their black market transactions were about 10% of what they purchased was on the black market. In Japan, that was closer to 50%. But so how is this related to the black market as Shizhou as an economic system? As I did mention, there were a lot of these were luxury items. So they weren't necessarily daily necessities, although I forgot who said this, but even something like chocolate, which is a luxury item, would have been very beneficial because of its high caloric intake. And so for people who were suffering calorie deficiencies, which was a big issue at this time, something like that would have been very crucial to their survival. But in terms of kind of the other kind of item that I did talk about, though, and something that I did find in my research, was this wasn't just luxury goods. When I was doing some research on Yokosuka, I found that a lot of people were breaking into the military base and stealing other just kind of everyday items. In the wintertime, we saw an increase of people who would break into the cars and steal blankets and coats. So I think there's kind of the item in like luxury items, military supplies, medical supplies, but then there's also just daily necessities. But in terms of kind of overall figures, I can't really, at this time, really put an exact number on, say, imports, exports, things like that. The data that I do have to work with is very limited. Usually what I rely on for just data on the extent of black marketeering is the court records that I had mentioned, that the system of courts that the occupation set up in 1946. And those are available at the National Archives. And I have used those a little bit. So that can give us kind of trends of how the black market is developing, but I can't really give an overall kind of exact figure. even kind of a rough estimate would be difficult.
Yes, Saki.
Yeah, my name is Saki. I'm another postdoc at the US Japan program. So I have a quite related question to that point. So it seems like, so I really like your argument that this black market created opportunity to change the image from enemy to business partner. I was wondering how much this image can be expanded to the entire Japanese population, because it sounds like there's like two types of market. The first market is about luxury goods, and the other is about everyday goods. And I think in your presentation, you mainly focus on the luxury goods. So like I thought the US military is more involved in the luxury market. So I thought like implication is that the more like richer urban population is involved in this like exchange with the US military. But like the other like more poor or like the poor population was not so much, involved in this black market with the like US military. It was like that kind of like impression that was like what I got from your talk. But like, could you clarify, for example, like who are the main like Japanese customers who are involved in this like market with the US military, and how much it changed across time?
Thank you. Those are all wonderful questions. I think, so the first question is kind of like what kind of, how many people in the population really were transformed or viewed America differently through this type of economic transaction? I think that's difficult because we also don't know how many people actually consume these goods. But in terms of like different population, I think everyone in Japan was just equally, I don't say equally, but everyone was suffering through, was facing economic scarcity. Everyone had to, regardless of what class you were, everybody, unemployment, everyone had to rely on the black market because everything was rationed. And because those rations were usually not enough or they didn't arrive on time, everybody had to rely on the black market at some point. But in terms of who, what's the extent of kind of the black market? So you're right. And you point out that, as consumers, kind of how many of these consumers are there? I don't know, but I can also talk about kind of the extent of the impact of the black market empire that it had on people. And that I can't really quantify, but, just to give you one example, I use the word PX, post-exchange. When I talk about the word post-exchange in Japan today, especially to younger people, they have no idea what I'm saying unless they're in the military. But when I talk to the older generation that lived through the occupation, they know exactly what it is. And it was actually, it was kind of a buzzword. And when I was doing a lot of research and reading a lot of magazine articles, this was a big deal. The PX is a symbol of America's economic power. And so it did have kind of a certain allure to it. And it did have made people view America in a very different way. And in many ways, they were kind of, they really desired those things that they couldn't get. It was the forbidden fruit for them. So it did maybe change their view of America. The other kind of related issue too is, who had these items. I don't know if this is necessarily related to the black market, but I think a big image of this time is the giving of chocolates to little kids. I don't think that was technically illegal, but I'm trying to figure this out because the poster said that it was illegal to give tobacco products. And so I need to read kind of the legal, kind of some of the legal acts that I had posted in detail because they were mostly about selling, but there seems to be some indication that might have been against the law. So in that case, would we consider children who receive these goods as kind of part of this consumers of the black market empire, perhaps? I don't know if that answers your question, but thank you.
I have several questions, including a couple online. So I'll read one question, and then Nakano-san, another question, and then if we can, if we have time, come back to you. So this is from Midori Yoshi. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. Have there been other studies focused on the post-war black market in Japan? I can't think of any now. If there hasn't been many before, why do you think there was not enough interest in the subject?
That's a great question. So have there been no studies? So in the English language literature, I can't think of a single monograph that's been dedicated specifically to the black market. There's a fairly well-known article, Need Greed in the Japanese by, I forget the exact title, but there is one article. Dower writes extensively about this in I think 2 chapters in Embracing Defeat. There hasn't really been much done in American scholars and people who write in English. But I will say this, the subfield of Yamiichi Kenkyu, or black market studies, has really taken off in Japan. Ever since the 1980s, where scholars finally got together and thought, hey, this is actually something that's worthy of academic inquiry. That's really blossomed in the last 20 years. And there's been a lot of horrific research in not just history, but in other fields as well, in sociology, urban history, architecture, culture, media studies. I mean, this field has really taken off, but in the United States, we don't see that as much. And to be honest, it's a bit of a puzzle about why no one has really, as far as I know, no one's really worked on the post-war black market, because I think there's certainly still lots of potential. There's lots of topics I think that people could do. I think my sense, and kind of one of the things that I ran into when I first started studying this topic, is that people think that because it's illicit economies, maybe there aren't a lot of extant sources. This is kind of something that's very difficult to study, but there are in fact a lot of sources, and I discovered a lot of sources that had been previously classified that I was able to write quite extensively about. And I think there's still, I found a lot of really rare sources in Japan. Just talking to curators at museums, I found some really rare things on the secondary market. So that's kind of a puzzle for me, but I would say that perhaps it's just that there's a view that people think that there's just not a lot out there, but there really is. So I'm hoping maybe this will encourage somebody maybe to also get interested in black market studies. I don't know, we'll see.
Thank you. Thank you, Jesus, for fascinating discussion. And I'm Koichi Nakano, also an associate at the US Japan program. I also want to come back to this point, very interesting point, from moving from enemies to illicit business partner, and then I guess eventually legitimate business partner. And so I think, the black market is illicit only if you take the position that this is, of course, so it's about less about perception about the change of these relationships, but more in terms of how we interpret the war, and also the nature of American empire that you're talking about. Because if you take the view that, of course, that, this is America trying to defend the rule of law, property rights, this kind of Lockean idealized version of the liberal agenda, then of course it's illicit. But you already touched upon this functionalist interpretation that this is not just a problem, but it's solution to the problems on both sides. Then you carry the logic even further to more kind of materialist direction and look at the war as basically a capitalist imperial war. And of course, the nature of the America, not as wanting to govern, but just wanting to trade. Then I guess, the black market is not really all that black anymore, but it's more like pilot market. It's sort of a precursor of things to come. And you can even understand that this is like America wanting to trade with Japan, with Vietnam, and wanting to keep this economic sphere. And this is what the war was all about. And so then I was starting to wonder, if you take that logic, and I'm not sure whether that's a legitimate step of logic to take, but if you take that logic, then how serious can they be to try to curb this? Because at the end of the day, that's exactly what they wanted to do. Right? I mean, selling American goods, Coca-Cola worldwide, was exactly the purpose of these wars. And so isn't it more like a precursor? This is like a pilot market. I mean, of course, I'm saying something very extreme, but just for the sake of argument.
Yeah, no, these are terrific points, and I'm happy you mentioned this, because these are kind of things that I've been wrestling with, the nature of American empire. You mentioned kind of capitalism. I do think this does represent a kind of a different trajectory of empire when we think about kind of why Americans were interested in Asia during the 19th century. They saw it as a place for markets to sell goods. They wanted, the open door to China. But when they get to occupy Japan, this is not a capitalist society. This is a system that they impose. This is a controlled military economy with all these regulations. And so when we think of, the open door, this was not an open door. This was a closed door. They wanted things to be confined to the military bases, and they couldn't. But it kind of brings up an interesting point. I think it's an important one that you brought up, is kind of what's the purpose of this, like, American empire? What are some of are there any imperial designs through the black market? I think that's kind of what you're implying. What I also find, though, is that there are differences between kind of the upper echelons of the US military, the officials, the policymakers, and the people on the ground who are actually engaging in this type of black marketeering. So just to give you one example, you might want to, it sounds kind of strange, though, that they kind of, just how military discipline breaks down very quickly. and they're breaking all the rules, they don't really care. And a lot of that is political because they believe that things like that exchange rate that they set that was unfavorable, they thought that was for political reasons. And they thought that, the people at the top aren't really concerned about the rank and file. So if we sell a few goods on the black market, who cares? Because it's the US, and because it's ultimately the military and, well, it's really the American taxpayer who's losing. But it does kind of create this interesting point because I did say in the 1950s, there are some of these goods that, like Coca-Cola, are able to get into the market, and it's through the black market that they're able to do it. But my argument would be that there was never anything intentional. And that's actually one of the bigger arguments I'm trying to make, is that with the black market empires, that I think we need to rethink the nature of American imperialism. And so I'm kind of trying to argue against that there was some kind of grand imperial design to trade with Japan, but that's just my view. Thank you.
So let me go back to the chat, and then maybe what I'll do is now 2 chat questions. So I'll read them, and then maybe you could ask your question, and then in the time we have remaining, is just good answer. So one of the chat question is from John Menzing. Obviously, the illicit market you delineate was not foisted upon a pristine white market. How would you characterize the black market exclusive of PX items? And then Sujin Han wrote, hi, Jesus. Thank you for the talk. It gets better and better. I'm curious about how, you have very loyal friends. I'm curious about how you're thinking about the nature of the black market empire over time. Are you conceptualizing it as one that is increasingly co-produced by the US military in Japan? Is it something more global when we think about US bases in Europe? And then finally.
Okay, I'm David Groff. I had a postdoc at the Reischauer Institute 37 years. My question, this term black market, can it apply to the labor market too? I had many relatives and teachers who were involved in the occupation, and these bad labor markets seem to be a big problem. First of all, in pimping services, and also in the supplying of domestic helpers. So how about this? Can this apply to the labor market as well? And how is that controlled? And was that an issue? It's a big question. It's too big to ignore it, but.
That's a great question. So yes, it did apply to the labor market. And this was something that came up more in the conversations that the occupation had after there was a series of violent turf wars in the black markets between some of the Yakuza gangs. And so what they did is they rounded up all the Yakuza, they did some research, and they had this Oyabun SCAP conference where they all sat down and they talked about some of the problems that the Yakuza were creating, not just the black markets that were selling these kinds of goods, but also some of the other things like labor. And they were involved in kind of like brokers as labor. So yes, that was definitely something that they had talked about. It didn't necessarily involve the US military directly, other than the fact that they were trying to kind of stamp out some of this bad behavior that these gangs were doing. And then, so I hope that gets to your question. The other one was about how do I see this in terms of kind of the global in Europe. This is something that I'm also thinking of right now, because I do think that, for example, the maritime smuggling, trans-Pacific maritime smuggling route, and also I've talked about the smuggling of narcotics from occupied Japan to the US West Coast is something I've written about. I mentioned the illicit trade in strategic goods during the Korean War. I think that because there were hot wars in Asia during the Cold War, this did definitely have an impact on how the black market empire developed, and that's why it's different from Europe. I could be wrong, but I think my sense is kind of illicit trade in Europe was kind of confined to the continent, and maybe just those particular bases that were in those countries in Europe. I don't know if there was any kind of transatlantic smuggling like we saw the trans-Pacific smuggling routes during the post-war period. And as far as the rest of the development in Asia, I'm also kind of interested in the Korea connection. And I want to talk more about Korea because we see similar black markets that are forming in Korea. But at the same time, the black market in Korea, as I mentioned, the black market kind of dies down in the 1970s in Japan. On the other hand, in Korea, I found incidents of even the early 2000s of a black market and post-exchange goods going on in Korea. So I'm kind of looking at Korea as kind of a place where the black market persists while it declines in Japan. So that's kind of where the research is going.
You didn't answer, we're about out of time, but
Yeah.
there was a question about black market activity, not including the PX items, but
Oh,
just a more general, other things at the black market that didn't come from the PX system.
Okay, I see.
And if you could answer like
I'll ask.
12
it's a great
seconds, that would be
question.
great.
Yes, so those came from a variety of sources. A lot of those were smuggled from Japan's former colonies. But a lot of that also came from the countryside, and we also see this illicit market develop between rural areas where people would go and trade items for vegetables and rice, and they would bring those back, and those would supply a lot of the urban black markets.
Okay, great, thanks very much. Yeah, about 12 seconds, great. Thank you again, Jesus, for a wonderful talk. Thanks, everybody, for your great questions, and we'll see you next time.